Welcome to today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Higley, and this is the show where we break down what it takes to build elite strength, conditioning, and athleticism for the everyday athlete.
In today's episode, we're talking trunk training, and you might know it as core work, but we'll be going a little bit deeper. I'm going to break down why I prefer the term trunk musculature, the science and physiology of what these muscles actually do, how I program them for strength that carries over into everyday life, performance, and injury prevention. I'm going to finish off with my list of the trunk exercises I program the most for myself, my clients, and my athletes, and why they work so well. So if you're still just doing a couple sets of crunches or planks at the end of your workout, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Hello, everyone, and welcome into today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you know that I'm big on breaking down the why behind training and programming. Not just handing out random workouts or random programs, but actually showing you how you can train better and how to build better programs and things that actually move the needle for strength, conditioning, hypertrophy, muscularity, and then they ultimately carry over into your everyday life. And so that's a big reason ultimately why I pursued, advanced degrees in exercise science, got into academia and research in the first place. And it's because I wanted to go past the surface level answers, the things that you could find on bodybuilding.com at the time, and I wanted to know how something works, why it works, and whether there's evidence that actually supports and backs that up ultimately. And then I take that knowledge into the programs that I write for my athletes, and they can actually see and feel that working. And so that's, a little bit of background for that. And so for me, training isn't just about what we put on a whiteboard, what we put into Team Builder, what we put into Train Heroic, but it's about understanding more of the principles behind it. And so that way you can own your results and continue to make progress for years and not just weeks at a time. Now, today's episode is one of those areas where the details really start to matter. And the term core gets thrown around a lot in the fitness world. But when we're talking strength, performance, injury prevention, we have to look at it a little bit differently. And so today I want to challenge you a little bit to think about this element of your training, this one particular piece. And we're going to reframe it in a way that allows you to approach it a little bit differently. And we're going to dig into the physiology behind it, some of the anatomy, and we'll talk about how to train with a purpose for trunk musculature. So first, I want to start by digging into some of the language. And because I really think that details matter here, and words matter here. So first, whenever people say core, what are they usually referring to? And usually it's the abs, right? We think of the six pack. We think of the visible abs that we can see. Sometimes they're talking about the obliques, if we're being generous. But the truth is that core is simply a buzzword. It gets thrown around. It's in social media posts. It's in blogs. It's on websites. And in sports and performance and anatomy, we're talking about something that's much bigger than just the core. And this is why I refer to it as the trunk musculature, because you'll see here that the core is not just the abs that we can visibly see when we're at a very low body fat percentage, but it's much deeper than that. And so we're actually talking about the trunk musculature. Now, what all does this include? What does this entail? And so I'm just going to kind of go through them and break it down here. So yes, the rectus abdominis, those are your abs. That's the six pack. That's included in this. We do have the obliques, your internal obliques, your external obliques. We have the transverse abdominis, which is more of your deep abdominal wall. We have the erector spinae and the multifidus, and those are in your back. And then we have glutes, lats. These help to stabilize the spine. And then even the diaphragm and the pelvic floor help you to create intra-abdominal pressure. And so when you realize that the core is made up of a lot more than just the six pack, you start to view this as a larger picture and stop viewing them in that isolation. And you stop training in your programming, you stop training for just aesthetics but you start training more for the function, things that carry over into your everyday life. And so now when we talk about the trunk anatomically, we're talking from the thoracolumbar junction down to the patella. So basically the middle of your back down to your kneecaps. A lot more than just the six pack. And so its primary job is to control and resist motion of that lumbopelvic hip complex. Now that is your lower back, your pelvis, your hips, even your spine. And so in simple terms here, it's there to keep your midsection solid so that your arms and your legs can do their job, do what they need to do from a performance standpoint, from an everyday, living standpoint, without wasting excess energy, and then also without putting you at a higher, risk for injury. So the best way to think about this is the core is there for stability first, not movement. We always think of core exercises as we're flexing the trunk, right? We're doing ab crunches and things like that. But really stability is truly what the purpose and the job of the core is. So that stability now, it allows us to, one, transfer force more efficiently from the ground through the lower body, across the trunk, and then into the upper body. And it also allows us to control excessive torque. So your joints can stay healthier. Energy isn't lost before it gets into the target. And so an example of this would be, we're throwing a ball and your trunk can't control thoracic extension. So basically your upper back is arching too much. Now your diaphragm isn't depressed. You've lost, a lot of that brace that you've created, that pressurized position, and the deep stabilizers of the trunk aren't engaged. Your scapula, your shoulder blade, it's not going to stay on the rib cage as it rotates through. Now, ultimately, what happens here is this is a power leak. It's a joint stress risk, and it's a trunk control problem, not a shoulder problem. So whenever you think of pitchers getting injured, a lot of times this is part of that reason why. Now, performance-wise, I approach trunk training in 3 tiers. So the first is intrinsic core stability. These are your deep stabilizers like the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, and they're trained with breathing and bracing drills. Second is dynamic stability. Here we're resisting flexion, extension, and rotation while we're moving or we're under load. And then third is ballistic stability. So this is high velocity control and force transfer in those athletic patterns like sprinting, cutting, or throwing. Now, the mistake that most people make here is they skip the first 2 tiers and they jump straight into the ab exercises. They do power work. And that's like, essentially building a roof before we've built a foundation for the house. And so now let's talk about how I actually program this. Because I think that knowing the tiers is one thing, but building them into a training week in a way that actually sticks is where those real results can come from. And so when I program trunk work, I always build it off the 3 tiers we just talked about, and I make sure that they show up at least once a week, every week. So again, tier 1 is intrinsic core stability, and this is where we talk about teaching breathing, bracing, and control. And here I'm looking for athletes, I'm looking for clients to connect the diaphragm and the pelvic floor and to own a neutral spine, and then control that position while breathing. So here we can use things like dead bug variations, quadruped holds, bird dogs, crawling patterns, and we'll often pair them with tempo breathing. And so a good example here is doing basic 5 seconds in, 3 second hold, 8 seconds out. We can even go 4 in, 12 hold, 8 out. This is a reset. This is your foundation. And if you're skipping this element, then everything else that we're doing to train the trunk is built on that shaky foundation, that shaky ground. Now, tier 2 is our dynamic stability. And so here we're resisting unwanted motion, whether that's flexion, extension, rotation, and we're doing it while we're moving or we're under load. Now, this could be implemented through tall kneeling or half kneeling chops and lifts, Palloff presses, plank variations with perturbations, a number of carries, anti-rotation landmine movements, rollouts using a ring or TRX bands, those types of fallouts, and then even strict knee raises, like hanging knee raises. And the idea with tier 2 is we're trying to challenge the trunk to stay rock solid when the body is in motion or the load is trying to pull you out of that position, hence the anti, positions. And then tier 3 is our ballistic stability. And this is where the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of maintaining trunk control whenever speed and force is high. And so here we can use medicine ball rotational throws, overhead or incline sprints. We can do sled marches or bounds, band resisted change of direction drills. And tier 3 is that bridge between the stability work in the gym and the way that your body actually has to perform on the field, the court, or in your everyday life. Now, the beauty of this framework is that it can scale. Again, everything's scalable. A beginner can live mostly in tiers 1 and 2, and then our more advanced athletes can cycle through all the way every single week. They can hit all 3 tiers every single week. But no matter where you're at, make sure that you do not skip that foundation. And then from a programming perspective, frequency-wise, I usually program 2 or 4 dedicated trunk slots each week. Sometimes they're a standalone block, but usually they're embedded into a workout, like a warm-up or some type of circuit. But the key throughout is progression. So we can increase the challenge of the movement by increasing lever lengths. We can add more load or more reps. We can slow down the tempo a bit to allow for more of that stability work to take hold, and then more speed or complexity for the ballistic work. Now, if we put all of that into practice, here are the 5 trunk exercises that I find myself programming the most. These would be my favorites. I program them most for my athletes within my programs and also myself. And so number 1 is the ab wheel rollout. Now, this sits squarely in that anti-extension category from tier 2. And it forces you to brace and maintain trunk positions as your arms move overhead. And it trains more than the abs. That's why I love the ab wheel rollout, because you get a lot of lat and shoulder activation. And that's that type of stability that you need when you're lifting heavy or absorbing force. Whenever I work with football athletes and our linemen, we are doing a lot of ab wheel rollouts with them because they have to kind of be in that position in order to block. Number 2 is the suitcase carry. Again, love this one. This is an anti-lateral flexion, also in tier 2. Here you've got one heavy dumbbell or a kettlebell in one hand, and your job is to keep basically your torso from leaning side to side. Now, these build incredible trunk stability, and they also, are a killer for grip strength and gait mechanics. Number 3 is the hanging knee raise, and these are done strict with no kipping. Now, here we're training hip flexion under that trunk stability, and these are a great way for you to connect the lower abdominals and the hip flexors while controlling your position on the bar. A lot of times you can do these hanging from your hands, or like I've got the from Spud Inc., these little straps that your arms fit into, and it allows me to hammer out 5 sets of 15 no problem, because my grip is not limiting there. But however you want to train them, like doing a strict hanging knee raise is a great movement to train those hip flexors and those lower abdominals. The number 4 is the Palloff press. Now, whether it's tall kneeling, split stance, this is anti-rotation at its finest here. So it teaches you to brace against asymmetrical forces, which is exactly what's happening in sports and in real life. Now, number 5, to round this out, is the tall kneeling cable chop or lift. And this one bridges into tier 3 a bit. It trains more of that diagonal force transfer, and the hips basically are opposite to the shoulder, shoulder to the opposite hip, which is the same pattern that you'll see when you're throwing a ball, swinging a bat, or shooting a hockey stick, punching, striking, whatever it may be. And now, I love these movements, these 5 here, because they're not just random ab moves that you'll find in a core circuit or a core class on Apple Fitness or YouTube or Instagram, whatever it may be. And each one can still plug directly into the framework that we just talked about. They're scalable, they're effective, and they carry over to basically any athletic and everyday movement that you'll do. Whenever I'm programming these, whenever I program the trunk into the week, my Mondays and my Fridays, or basically my 2 lower body days, are generally some type of anti-extension movement. So we're focusing more vertically, whereas Wednesdays and Sundays, or our upper body days, that's when we do a lot more of our anti-rotation movement. So we're doing Palloff presses, we're doing carries, and that type of work. And so, thank you. If you take anything away from today, stop thinking. So if you take anything away from today, stop thinking about your core as just your six pack and start to think of your trunk as your foundation. Make sure that you're training it in all of the planes, in all of its roles. And ultimately, if you do so, you will lift heavier, you'll move faster, you'll feel better, and you'll stay healthier in the long term. So that is how I think about trunk training. That's the framework, the science, the 5 moves that I program the most. And if you want to see exactly how I work these into a full training session, then make sure you're following me on Instagram and YouTube at Higley Strength. And that's where I'll be breaking these down in more detail, along with plenty of other training and programming insights. And of course, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss what's coming next, because we've got a lot more to cover. I want to thank you for listening in, and as always, train smart.
That's it for today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. If you got value from this, do me a favor, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who would benefit. And if you want more insights, exclusive training tips, and in-depth breakdowns of the latest research in strength conditioning, join my Performance Edge newsletter. It's my free weekly email where I cut through the noise and break down what actually works in training, nutrition, and performance. Sign up today at higleystrength.com. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you next time.